Tonight's event is hosted through a partnership between Village Books and Western Washington University's Center for Canadian American Studies. We are so grateful to them for their support. The moderator for tonight's event is Kat Wallace, journalism instructor at Whatcom Community College and editor. Welcome, Kat. And
Hi.
Donald.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Donald K. Alper, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Western Washington University, is the former director of Western's Center for Canadian American Studies and the Border Policy Research Institute. Known nationally for his advancement of Canadian studies in the United States, he has taught courses on Canadian politics and Canada-U.S. relations for more than 40 years. We are here tonight to celebrate the book right here, Bridging the Longest Border, A History of Canadian American Studies at Western Washington University. Please welcome Don Alper and Kat Wallace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deshali. Dawn, it's been a while. Hi.
Yes, it has. Good evening.
Dawn and I have been working on this book for a little while, right?
Oh, yeah.
What made you want to start this book, this big project?
Well, it's a good question to start this off. Why would I take on this thing, and why did you get involved?
Yes, how did I get involved? How did you rope me into this?
a number of reasons. I think that probably the most important one is that the Canadian Studies program at Western has been around for a long time, and it's not always as well recognized as one would like. And also, there has been Canadian influence, of course, in our area, in the city of Bellingham and Whatcom County. It's just part of the physical geography and economic structure of this whole region that we are so impacted by Canada. Mm-hmm. So it seemed to me that this would make an important contribution to Western history, to have this story of this very interesting program somehow put together and included in the corpus of other materials on Western history. That was probably the main reason, but also there were other reasons. And if I could quickly just add to that, when you, yes, with a program like this, there's always something called institutional history, which sometimes get lost as people retire and new directors take over, and then they retire and new directors take over. And sometimes programs find themselves in deep financial problems and they may sort of go stagnant for a while. That hasn't happened, fortunately, to our program.
No.
So one of the things
how long has it been around?
One of the things I wanted to do was to create an institutional history for the university, so that this thing is documented, that it's been here all these years, and hopefully it'll go on for many more. So those are a couple of reasons.
We're at the 50th, right? This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Canadian American Studies Center at Western.
That's correct.
2021. Yes.
Yes.
I believe that. Yeah, we would have normally wouldn't we have a big party? Sorry, I think we had one at the 40th that was quite well attended by big people from both sides of the border, right?
Right.
So this year, this is a more subdued, which is typical of the Bellingham subdued excitement. The 50th anniversary of this place. You're right. You're absolutely right. There is probably a dearth of people who understand Canada, Canadian politics, the economy, and it's just the Salish Sea, which is the cover of your book, which is gorgeous, that shows this area. We are right here in the middle of the Canadian waters almost. So we share a lot of space with Canada. So having not known a lot about this area and moving up here, I appreciate your institutional history and knowledge. So when you started writing, what was the writing process like for you? I mean, you just retired, and golfing is one of your favorite things, I think, right?
That's for sure.
So why did you want to sit inside and write this book? And how did you come about with, what was your process?
Well, it was a kind of an interesting combination of two genres of writing. On the one hand, the book is intended to be a credible history of the program. It's something that I wanted to, document events and activities over the years and make it as strong a history as possible. But at the same time, since I was such an important part of this program for so many years, it's a big part of my life as well. So also that included in the book is a kind of memoir of my work with the Center for Canadian American Studies, some of my observations and thoughts about how things have gone and how we connect to the real world of Canada-U.S. relations, which, by the way, is another reason I think someone might want to pick up this book, is because there's not a lot of history available, easy history available around here about the relationship between Washington State and particularly the northwest corner of Washington State and Canada and British Columbia. And those relations are so important and have been so important to our way of life for so many years that by reading this book about this program over the years, how it developed, you also have a kind of, shall we say, a window on what's been happening in British Columbia, Washington relations over the years. And I think that's needed because people simply don't get that kind of information very often.
No, and that brings to me the title, because we are connected by our geography, and we're very much connected. And so I do remember, because we edited together for quite some time, and we were very just bouncing around ideas about the title. And tell me how this one came to you.
Well, I think
Bridging the Longest Border.
It wasn't easy, but it's a simple title, so it probably looks like something we picked up at the very beginning. I've always thought about something to do with bridging because I like it as a metaphor. And obviously a border is a physical barrier in some respects. It's also kind of an opening for all kinds of activity, economic activity, people movement, and so on. But I think when we think of borders, we mostly think of sort of stopping things from happening. We think of barriers put in place. We think of impediments. And when it comes to educating Americans about Canada, the last thing we want to do is put any impediments in their way. So it seemed to me that using the word bridging as a kind of metaphor for openness, for connecting, for transcending, for moving beyond was a proper word to kind of get to the essence of what the book is really about, and that is the importance of educating Americans about our most important neighboring country.
Right. And so when you were thinking that, or actually we are at 50 years, so this started in the 60s, right? And the idea started in the 60s. And why don't you talk about how the idea of, why don't we know enough about Canada? Why are we sitting here literally miles, just under 23 miles from another country that we know very little about? So who was the germinator of this idea?
Well, that is really what started the program, is the realization on the part of a lot of people, mostly Americans, but also Canadians, because one of the things about Western Washington University is that we have had strong connections with Canada going all the way back to the beginning. As people probably know, if they're familiar with the university, it started as a teachers' college, and a big chunk of British Columbia teachers and administrators actually came down here to get their degrees. There's a lot of reasons for that, which are described in the book. I won't get into it right now.
Yes, make them buy the book.
That's right. So there is that feeling that's been around for a long time. It still exists. It's not just a feeling, it's a reality that we simply are unaware of the importance of our neighbor to the north, but we're also simply ignorant of a lot of things that happen in Canada. We don't understand very much about how their political system works. We're sometimes completely dumbfounded by how the whole province of Quebec fits into the larger Canadian Federation. There's just a lot of areas about Canada that we're simply not very, very aware of. And so people thought this was kind of strange. Here we have a university that's had these Canadian connections that's only 25 miles from the border, which sits within roughly 48 miles of Canada's third largest city, this huge metropolis of Vancouver.
Right.
And here we don't know much about it. And so the thinking was going back probably even before the 60s, but when I started documenting what people were doing, it really began in the 60s. That seems to be when things really started to get revved up. That isn't it crazy that we don't have a formal program that attempts to educate Americans about Canada? Let's try to do something at Western Washington University.
Right, we're perfectly poised. We're right at the, you're right. And it was a well thought out thing. And then, so it took a little while, right? It took a little while to get it off the ground and to get people interested, because this was the 60s and the 70s. And we're talking about, you know, student protests. We're talking about borders that are, you know, people running from, you know, the draft at the time. We're trying to get away and get into Canada. And Canada was saying, hey, we've got things we got to be doing, and protests on campus, all the things were happening. So then it took a little while, right? So talk about who got involved specifically and how we got the names that we used in the book that you referenced. Like,
It did take a
Bob.
while, longer than one would think. Interestingly enough, there was a mix of people. I call them inventive faculty and interested community people that really kind of had the ideas, but they weren't really together on it. But what really, I think, was the spark that got the ball rolling, got the momentum going to actually develop a real academic program focused on Canada was, interestingly enough, a Bellingham ophthalmologist by the name of Robert Kaiser, who in the early 1960s took a course on Canada from Professor Robert Monahan, who's mentioned extensively in the book, and we'll probably talk a bit about Monahan later.
Yes.
Kaiser was an older student who was actually just taking this class because he was just interested in Canada. And it was really his discussions with Monahan that sort of got the ball rolling in terms of thinking about developing a formal program. Kaiser was he had contacts with Canada. He had business interests in Canada. His children actually went to school in British Columbia, or at least some of them did. So he was quite interested. He was also a very worldly person, and he had been around the world in many different capacities. And he also owned his eye clinic in Bellingham, had Canadian employees, and he also had quite a few Canadian customers. So he was very much tapped into Canada. And he was just sort of taken by this idea that somehow we're not knowing enough about this country that's so important to us. He also was concerned about, you mentioned the draft dodgers, you mentioned the Vietnam War protests, these kinds of things that were happening in the 1960s. He was worried that Canada and the United States were starting to split apart in terms of their perceptions of the world, and they were starting to have some rough times when it came to particularly the Vietnam War. And so he was concerned about anti-Americanism developing in Canada, which it was. And so he thought what we really need to do, and I think this kind of highlights the essence, the principle of the whole book, is we need to develop some kind of a program in which we educate people really on both sides of the border about the other country, not just for the sake of education. I mean, that's probably worthy in its own right, but because when you have a relationship like we have between these two countries who have probably the most harmonious and peaceful relationship in the world, or at least one of them, and it's starting to look like it's falling apart, it's important to rebuilding that relationship and ensuring that it continues to be strong.
Exactly.
And one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is the importance of education to building trust and respect for national partners or countries that are part of, that you interact with on a regular basis. So this is kind of where it all came from. And there's a lot about what Robert Kaiser did on his own to try to make this dream of his happen. And he was finally successful in the sense that he got the ball rolling, then the faculty took it from there.
Because it makes sense. You're right. It makes sense to understand each other is to get along, basically, to see how they view us and we view them. It's not really us and them, but there's this neighbor thing. You're afraid of your neighbor until you get to know your neighbor. I don't know if if that's an appropriate metaphor. My neighbor's probably on this Zoom, so I better be careful. But yes, knowing your neighbor and understanding. And then I like the fact that he's just, Kaiser was just a businessman in town. He was an ophthalmologist. He took a class because Western was the only place you could take classes. Whatcom didn't exist. There was no community college, go take a class for personal education and enrichment. So he goes to Western and just takes a class that Bob happened to be teaching. Now, Bob's a geography teacher, correct?
Correct.
So, yes. So talk about Bob. Let's talk about Bob, because we had a fun picture when we were looking through some of the archives in which, he had just become a new teacher. And I met Bob, and he's a delightful person. And I know you dedicated your book to Bob. He was a mentor to you, and we lost him last year. And
sadly.
I think this is a beautiful way of honoring his legacy. So talk about your relationship with Bob and how you got personally involved. So now we're getting there.
Bob was one of the early pioneers, one of the faculty members that was really interested in doing something about Canadian studies at the university. I mean, there were others, James Scott, who was a geographer, Barry Goff, who was a Canadian, but a historian at Western. Manfred Vernon. These people are all mentioned in the book. People who are familiar with Western will know some of these names. Jerry Rutan, who was the first director of the program when it started in 1971. Bob took over the directorship of the program in 1976. And he was the perfect person for that position. And why do I say that? Well, at the time, I really didn't know him very well. I knew of him, he knew of me, but it was just kind of people passing in the night. The reason why he was such an ideal person for the program was he was one of these people that was do anything he could for the common good, for the cause. He wasn't into it for personal grandiosity or anything like that. He was interested in building the program because he believed in the mission of trying to educate Americans about this country that's so important to the United States. And so Bob was the kind of guy that would work constantly. I mean, I don't know where he got the energy. I don't know where he got the time, but he was always out there beating the bushes, looking for money. And that was tough because we weren't a regular department in the university. And so we didn't have a regular line budget, which a department like chemistry or physics or mathematics or political science has. And so it was always a matter of trying to first persuade the administrators at the college. If it was a college in the beginning, it didn't become Western Washington University until 1977. But it was always a problem of trying to find money, trying to mobilize faculty to spend time on Canada, because usually faculty had positions in other departments. And so working for Canadian studies was kind of like working overtime from a regular job. And so it was trying to find ways to connect those things and make sure that happened. And he was so good at that. And he used to tell me when he would go out and ask somebody for money for the program and they'd say no. And I'd say, well, then what did you do? I would just be shocked, or not shocked, but I would just feel like that's what happened. That's the end of it. He said, no, that's not the way it works. He says, no means to me, not now.
No.
It means we go back later. And he believed in that and he did it. And of course, under Bob's tutelage, the program really came to a high level through distinguished professorships, through getting a huge grant from the federal government starting back in the 1980s and 1986, which we still have today.
Oh, good. Yes.
This was a lot largely the result of Bob. He also was responsible for something that's very important in keeping the program going, and that's Canada-U.S.
You're right. Yes. Do you want me to show a picture of Canada-U.S?
A picture, I'll talk a little bit about it.
Okay, which picture do you want me to show? Because I'll show.
Start with the one with the flags.
Okay, let's look at some pictures here. Okay. Let's go actually the one with the flag today. That's one. This one it's dated 1980, but yeah, you can see. Yep, you can see there's a Washington state flag, the American flag, and the Canadian flag, I believe. Is that the Canadian flag there?
Yep.
Yeah, that one looks a little stripy. But
so this
okay.
one of the things that Bob did soon after becoming director is he put together a long-term plan for the program. Now that sounds really boring. You know, everybody has to have a plan. Every administrator has to have a plan. But what Bob put in the plan were all the things that he said we needed to make this program successful over the long term and become what he hoped would be perhaps the strongest Canadian studies program in the United States. And so the reason I bring that up is one of the elements in that plan was a building or a facility of some kind that would be kind of distinct on campus that would house the program. Why was that important? Because it would give the program a sense of identity. It would have a unique position on campus. It would be noticeable. And when we had visitors from Canada or from other parts of the United States, they would know that this was Canada-U.S. Means this university takes this program very, very seriously. So
there it is, Canada-U.S.
That's the picture of it just after it became Canada-U.S. in 1977. Now, let me just quickly say something about the house. The house actually was built in 1909. It was built for the Henry Shupp family, who was a Bellingham businessman. And it's a large, as you can see, it's a large, old-fashioned, typical large Bellingham house. It got written up in the Bellingham Herald as one of the finest homes at the time, perched up on the hill above Garden Street, facing Bellingham Bay. And of course, what I loved about it was facing the Canadian mountains in the distance. So we have a Canada-U.S. on campus that I often tell my colleagues across the country with the only view of Canada. All the other Canada-U.S., they're looking at a parking lot or they're looking at something else.
Right. This is, I know, we can see Canada from our house, literally. Okay. Yes, this is from 1979, this one, I think.
This one, I think, is 1979 or 1980. So it just gives you an idea of the kind of classic element of the house. And
and there's Canada right there in the distance, right over this way.
Picture, because one of the things that we talk about in the book quite a bit is, you know, Canada-U.S. is a building, but it's also office space. And one of the interesting things about campuses, and I think this is true everywhere, is that office space is always something that's subject to great competition. It brings out the competitive spirit and jealousies and other things among faculty because everybody wants the best office, or at least a good office.
They do.
When the word got out that Canadian Studies was going to get this building, other programs and other units on campus became very jealous, and some thought, well, why are they getting special treatment? We want our house, or we want a building like that. And so the reason this picture is interesting is that one of those units on campus that was hoping to take over the house was something called the Faculty Club.
And that's these guys. These guys, right?
And this is the official opening of the Faculty Club in 1982. They moved into Canada-U.S. just that year. This was their official opening. And it never was a good relationship between our center and the Faculty Club. There always was a little bit of tension there because, you know, these people are interested in, and for good reason, are interested in having a place for socializing and meals and events like that. Whereas Canada-U.S., the academic program for Canadian studies, of course, is trying to conduct seminars, teach classes, do research. And so it's always kind of an uneasy relationship, but we did manage to make it work for quite a few years.
Yes, actually, Dawn, you and I spent a lot of time when we first started this project. I actually encouraged you to look through some of those boxes downstairs. So it has a basement, a classic basement, you know, stone, and it had flooded several times, had windows that just no one paid attention. So you and I went down there with one little bare bulb light and dug through some of those boxes to see what kind of things were being stored there. And it was interesting to note that a lot of the Faculty Club stuff was still down there, like cases of wine, bottles of beer, but you and I didn't touch any of that, did we? We went through all the archives and brought them upstairs. And I think, you know, one of the best things besides the book that came out of that was they have a clean basement now. But yes, so having your own space. For those who may not understand exactly, why is this not like an English department or a poli-sci department? Let's talk about the structure of what a center actually means.
That's a
People.
perfect question, really, because it's not the same as a regular department. For one thing, you don't have your own faculty. And you might have one or two distinguished professors or separate positions that have been somehow funded through usually an endowment or something over the years. But basically what you're doing is you're using faculty who are based in other departments. I'm a political scientist. So my home when I came to Western was in the political science department. Bob Monahan was a geographer. His home was in geography. Historians, sociologists, people from the arts, really from almost all the various programs on campus. We had faculty who were interested in Canada, who then became affiliated with the program, but their home base was not in Canada-U.S. or in the center per se. So
they were being paid their salary by political science department.
That's correct. That's correct.
But they would teach Canadian interesting,
they would teach. One of the things that you have to do as a person who's trying to coordinate all of this is put together teaching program and a research program and a public outreach program that involves these interested faculty. And you have to find ways and incentives to get them involved in this. And that's a lot of work. And it's also not the kind of thing that I think just anybody can do. So again, we're very fortunate that Bob set the stage.
Let's show Bob. Let me show Bob because he's on the, yes, let's show Bob. Bob is, he's instrumental, and I think you did speak to him a little. Let me see here. Hold on a second. That you were doing this. I might be freezing up a second. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Yes, let's go. Let's see Bob. There's Bob. So let's check out.
Bob's on the right. He's receiving.
This is Bob right here. Always smiling. That's what I remember about Bob. Always smiling.
This is in Bob's first office in Canada-U.S. And you might recognize those of you who are watching that are familiar with Western or Bellingham and Whatcom County politics. You'll probably recognize the person on the left is Barney Goltz. For a long time, a campus planner, and then he was in the legislature as a senator and a representative. What Barney's doing there is he's handing, really kind of exchanging flags here. He's handing Bob a Washington state flag to be used to fly, like you saw in that earlier picture, on the flag staffs outside the base, outside the front of Canada-U.S. That was, by the way, something we used to do as kind of a, just kind of a nice thing to, kind of an icebreaker. When we had guests, particularly from Canada, we would always make a point to fly the Canadian and the American flag. And then if the guest was from, say, Alberta or Quebec, we would also fly the Quebec or the Alberta flag, just as a way to show respect for our visitors. And it was something that really got a lot of interesting attention from those people. But that's Bob on the right, and he's receiving this flag. That's his first office downstairs in Canada-U.S.
Right.
That would have been right after it opened.
Christina might recognize this. These are the panels between they were the pocket doors that they had in the house. There were pocket doors for the living room, and then there was a dining room, which I think is her office. And so the current director. So let me stop the share real quick. Yes. So the center and this place for being, are there a lot of them in the country? Like I know that with my dealings, and I don't know if some people, I was the managing editor of the journal that was housed at the center for a little while, and now it's in Bridgewater State University in Maine. But we were all together, and what is in the house? So we had the journal for a while, but that moved to a different university. And what's there now?
Well, today it's actually quite a bit larger in terms of the number of programs that are there. They're all kind of Canadian studies.
It is expanded.
Programs. It's expanded quite a bit. That's part of the story, by the way, of this that this book tells. Is it starts out as a very small program with about maybe a dozen faculty members who have an interest in Canada. Commonly, as we talked earlier, they might go to lunch together. They sort of managed to cobble together a few classes to first create a minor in Canadian studies, and then a few years later, a major in Canadian studies. And then the program just started to grow. And it grew in terms of developing a whole lot of other facets of Canadian American studies, one of which was the Study Canada Outreach Program, which is a program for educating American public school teachers to teach Canada in their classrooms. You know, something that's very strange in a way is
Right.
that Canada hardly ever shows up in public school curriculum.
I
And
know that's funny to me. but
even
you're
here in
right.
Bellingham,
Right.
I remember when our daughter went to middle school, the place where Canada normally would show up in the 6th or 5th grade class, the teacher had the option of teaching Canada or Mexico or New Zealand. She opted for New Zealand. And here we are
Who wouldn't?
25 miles from the border. This is not
Exactly.
unusual.
No, this I don't think my kids ever learned anything about Canada
No.
in their curriculum, K through 12.
That's right.
So
So
yeah,
this
there's
is
still
something
work
that
to do.
it's been a mainstay of the program. It's developed over the whole period. We started our major effort in Canadian Studies public school outreach really a few years just after the program started. The program, by the way, started in 1971 officially.
Officially.
And
That's why, yeah,
officially. That's when we
2021 is our
actually had-
50th.
That's when we
Right.
hired a director. We had a small budget from the university. In other words, we had something that the
Mhm.
university approved as Canadian
House.
American Studies. And then the House came a few
Correct.
years later. Then the Study
Mhm.
Canada program and a whole series of other programs came after that. And so the
Right.
program continued to evolve. And to go back to your question, today within the center, we have the Academic Canadian American Studies program, which includes a major and a minor in Canadian American Studies. This is quite unusual, by the way. In the United States, there are only a few other centers that do this, and they're typically in the eastern part of the country.
It's true.
We
Mhm.
also have something called the Border Policy Research Institute, which is really a whole story of its own, which is
Right.
documented in the book quite extensively. That came in the early 2000s, largely as a result of the impact of 9/11.
Oh, yeah,
Everybody was worried about borders. You know, we're worried about the border now because of the pandemic, but in 2001, after 9/11, the Canadian-U.S. border closed for a short period of time, but then for quite a long period of time, they had something called total inspection protocol, in which everybody who crossed the border had to have their car searched. People had to have documentation like they've never had before. And eventually, of course, we had to have passports. And so the Border Policy Research Institute was created to try to help governments, Canadian federal governments, state and provincial governments, and even local governments to come up with policies that would make the border work better, to ensure that the security functions that were ramped up after 9/11 continued, but also make sure people can get back and forth, which is so important to the two
Right. It's
countries.
important to trade. It's important to, local economies. There are a lot of cross-border things that needed to happen that were stopped at that point. You're right.
And when you look
So
at
studying that, yeah.
when you look at the cultural ties, the family ties between
Right.
Washingtonians and British Columbians, it's extensive, it's enormous.
Mhm.
And anything that slows down the relationships or kind of puts a dampening on the ability to move
Mhm.
back and forth and interact with one another is not a good thing.
Right.
So the Border Institute was an attempt to try to help not fix the border, but try to come up with ideas and plans to make it work more effectively. And I think we did a lot of good work, and a lot of that's documented in the book. And then the third
Right.
new program, which is very recent, just started in 2015, is the Salish Sea Institute. And this is
Right.
another interesting cross-border phenomenon we have here in the region, where we have this magnificent inland sea out here, which of course is transboundary in its nature and can't be managed solely on one side of the border or the other side. It has to be managed collectively or jointly. And that was the reason why we created the Salish Sea Institute, to try to build
Right.
stronger consciousness and understanding of the importance of the Salish Sea, but also to make the point as powerfully as we can that we need collaborative, cooperative, cross-border action to save and nourish the Salish Sea over a period of time. So there's three big programs in Canada House right now that are called Canada House programs.
I know.
All of which, by the
And
way, are being very effectively managed by the team that's in place.
They are. And I was proud to be part of it. I got to tell you, you know, when I was, even though the journal that I worked on was a part of a bigger association of Canadian, it was great to be in that house with, you know, listening to conferences being planned, and you know, all the funding, the Title VI funding getting approved, and then seeing classes being taken in the sunroom. They have the porch opens up, it looks out onto the Bellingham Bay and sees Canada, and there's classrooms in there. And it's just really nice to be part of that and to understand Canadian scholars and students interested in studying Canada and being part of Canada. I mean, it is growing and it's strong, and it really needs to be something that people take care about trying to understand, because we're right here. It's like you said in the book at one point, you said a lot of students don't do a study abroad thing to Canada because it's not far enough away. It's not different enough. It's not New Zealand, and it's not, you know, Europe, but it's right here, and there's very European things about Canada, and there's very Americanized things about Canada. I mean, it was just, why aren't we looking closer at Canada? So it's worth it, right? Did you think it was worth it to do all that? You put 40 years of your life into this.
Not, well, I guess it was just about 40. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't take any of it back. It was more than worth it. It was a thrill. It was fun. I worked closely with Bob Monahan. I really consider him my mentor, as well as very, very, very close friend. Right. And as you said earlier, we really miss him. But yeah, there was no question it was worth it. I think I still do it. I'm still working on this kind of stuff. Mostly, this book was partly, I think, a labor of love, in the sense that I'm not trying to write an academic book for any kind of promotion or tenure or anything like that. I'm not doing that anymore.
You don't have to, right?
This was something that I just really felt that I needed to do. And I wanted to do it, and I enjoyed doing it. And you mentioned earlier about some of the documentary parts of trying to figure out what was happening, and some of the ways in which we collect information. And much of it, as you know, because you helped me with this, was digging through these old waterlogged boxes in the basement of Canada House, which are just full of files. Nobody had ever organized them.
No, and half of them were just budget requests and just paperwork.
So that was one part of the so-called archival work. But the other part was working in the Goltz-Murray archives, which of course is on campus, or on the edge of campus. And it was fabulous working with those people over there. And they had
the Washington State archives are literally on our campus for the whole state.
It's a gem of a resource. I think people are unaware of it. They have so much material. And
if anyone's writing a history of anything in Washington State, they need to know that you can go in there, ask for help, and they'll give it to you, right? They were very helpful.
They will give it to you, and they welcome you with open arms. They can't do enough for you. It was an amazing experience, and I really enjoyed poking around the files. There are tons of files from the early years. One of the things that's happened, and I'm not a historian by trade, but one of the things that must drive historians crazy is that once we got into the email mode, in which every bit of communication was over the computer through email and electronic kinds of or forms of communication, the number of documents dropped precipitously. So I noticed when we got into the 1990s, the presidential correspondence, which I relied heavily on, the provost correspondence, the correspondence from deans, just kind of disappeared. It's not there. Now they are trying to retrieve some of that, because email has to be saved. I don't know exactly what all the protocols are, but it will never be the same as reading through old letters and memoranda. I just love
and clippings from the student newspaper, I think helped you.
Exactly.
That was interesting. You're right. And I liked how you said you're not going to be a history or anything, and that the institutional knowledge, here you are, Don Alper, sitting in the desk of the director of Canadian American Studies Center. And, when you go, it goes with you, all that stuff. So I loved it when you would come up and you would find one little piece of paper. You go, I remember this. Oh, I got to tell you the story about this. And I'd say, put it in the book, put it in the book. And you said, oh, I remember when this happened. So then, and you had all these great stories that were kind of sparked and triggered by the piece of paper that you found in an old moldy basement. So, but your brain is the one that kept everything in there. You were the one who knows how it happened and what happened and how, So this is an important, like you said, artifact for the future.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think more could be done with it too. There's ways you could spin things off of this to build a stronger core of information about, not just the importance of Canadian studies, but the importance of Canada's Washington State. I think that's kind of a subtext in all of this is that I want people to be able to understand that this relationship between our state and the province and our state and Canada as a whole is very important. It's not going to become less important in the future. It's going to become more important, not just in trade, not just in the things security, the things we normally think about, but when you start thinking about like the environment, I mean, we share this environment. Right. We are part of the same environment here.
It's the same sea. We swim in the same water.
Exactly. And so these issues that come up are not their issues or our issues. They're both of ours issues. And you need a place like, I think you need a place like Western with a house like Canada-U.S, which houses something called Canadian Studies, that is a hub of resources that is available to not only teach about Canada and Canada-U.S. relations, but to stimulate research, to stimulate public dialogue about the importance of the relationship and how that will be more important, I think, down the road.
I think it'll be always important especially where we are here, especially that we are right here, all along the longest border. Here we are.
Exactly.
And it's the most peaceful, undefended border there is in the world. Am I right? I don't know. Maybe I have a myopic view.
The longest undefended border. Although one of the things that unfortunately happened after 9/11 is it's now a little more defended than it used to be. Some would say a little more militarized than it used to be. And that's unfortunate, but it's still basically a very open border as borders go across the world. And we want to keep it that
except
way.
For the pandemic. Now we've shut it down a little bit more. So
how that's going to play out down the road is going to be very interesting. And we have people working on that right now. I know Lori Troutman, the Border Policy Research Institute, has done some great work, become a huge resource for governments and business and just ordinary folks about what's happening with the border down the road, how this might impact what's going to happen with the border. And of course, Christina Kepi is doing a fabulous job in terms of incorporating all of these kinds of issues in her curriculum, which she's expanded quite dramatically over the last few years. So good things are happening. I'm very excited about it.
I know. And Ginny is still at the Salish Sea, am I right?
Doing
Salish Sea Institute, Ginny Hurst.
Yep.
Yep. And Tina Storer started the K-12 outreach, and I think Kyla Sweet is taking it now.
That's right. Tina retired.
Yep. And Kyla came in, and I think she's still working on that. And it's been a little while. I've been out of the loop since I still have the key though. Don't tell anybody.
So do I.
Do you? We'll go back and get some of that wine, shall we?
Yeah.
Well, should we ask for questions? It's like 11:45. What do you think? Shally, what do you think?
We can start doing questions now. There's one in the Q&A. What kind of professional roles are people fulfilling with a major or minor in Canadian American Studies?
Interesting. Don?
Sure.
Well, there are lots of different things. Quite a few roles which probably don't have a direct relationship to Canada. That's always the case with almost any major. But let me answer it this way. Many students who have majored or minored in Canadian studies or just taken a lot of classes in Canadian studies have ended up working for businesses or government which interact with Canada in some way. You know, there's so many large and small businesses that have Canadian connections. Sometimes they have offices located in both countries. And so there is a need for people in those businesses to have workers who have a kind of an understanding of the country in which they're very closely connected with. And sometimes it's not just an intellectual understanding, it's an emotional understanding or an emotional connection. And that impresses employers. So business, government, people working, for example, in the U.S. consulate in Vancouver, the Canadian consulate in Seattle, would be example of people in government. Some have gone back and worked in the State Department. They haven't necessarily ended up on the Canada desk, but the fact that they studied Canada was a part of a larger, for them, a larger study of international relations, which of course means that they're more qualified for these kinds of international jobs than they'd otherwise be qualified for. So
people don't realize it is an international job, even though we speak the same language, it's still another country. You are doing a binational thing when you study Canada.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we don't always understand about Canada is that it really is an international experience. If you do an internship in Canada, if you study in Canada, you're engaged in an international experience. And that's because we assume it's so close and people think it's so much like the United States that it's kind of not different enough to be worth studying. Of course, we try to dispel that notion. That's one of the first things that happens when you take a Canadian Studies course is we try to dispel that notion.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And the next one, Melanie Taylor is asking, is Dawn pictured with the faculty in the 1981 picture? I think that's
funny. Dawn, I don't think he would be in that picture because I believe there was some fighting among the faculty club on Fridays. Tell them what the faculty club did on Friday afternoons, Dawn.
Well, I wasn't in the picture.
No, you weren't.
In 1982, I was at Western in 1982.
Right.
And I was involved in the program as the associate director. But you have to read the book to understand the little we call it the Battle for Canada House, which may be an exaggerated title.
But it was
I'll just leave it at that and let the reader or the person asking the question can take a look at that whole point or that whole section and get an idea of what was going on. This goes back to the whole competition among programs for space and for the house. The house was coveted by many people.
Yes, everybody wanted it. And then, so faculty club, for those who don't know, on Friday afternoons, the faculty could come and have beers and wine and hang out and smoke cigars if they wanted to and do whatever. And then on Monday morning, Canadian people or Canadian studies people would come in and the place would smell like food and cigars and beer, and it smelled like a frat house or something. And I think that was kind of the thing, you know.
That was kind of a big part of the problem, but it wasn't anything about, I mean, everybody agreed the faculty club was a good idea.
That's fun, sure.
It didn't make sense to share Canada House, which was basically not just a house for an academic program, but had this symbolism that we talk about in the book, you know, the kind of symbol of something important in Washington State at the university about Canada. It just didn't make sense to have that program share space with a totally different kind of program, which was all about a social club and, you know, having parties and things of that kind. So it wasn't a great arrangement.
Yeah, and they had a kitchen and they cooked lunches and things like that. So yeah, no, Dawn is not in that picture. Question asker there. Yeah. So.
Thank you for your question, Melanie. And we have a question and comment from Heather. I grew up in Vancouver, BC, and learned the capitals of all the U.S. states in grade 4. Why don't Americans learn any geography? Or Canadian
Excellent
geography?
Point.
Or
excellent point.
Well, that's a really good point, and that's another reason why we have the program, because Americans don't learn much about Canada, and they should. Whether they need to learn the capitals or not, I'm not sure, but they certainly need to know more than they know. So I would say it's just something that's got missed the boat along the way somewhere. And one of the things we've been trying to do is remedy that problem. It's a slow process. You know, somebody once asked me, how do you know if you've been effective? And I said, well, it's hard to say. You know, it's what you hear back from students. It's what you see when governments do things, if they've actually somehow been affected by our work, our research. It's really kind of like, I think I described it to Kat as, it's like guerrilla warfare. You just you chip away here, you chip away there, you work here, you work there, you try to do as much as you can
Yeah.
to push
Triage.
the envelope towards greater education of Americans about Canada. That's all you can do.
That's the hope. You're right.
And Kaylee says, I don't think we learned our own capitals until 8th grade. I'm not sure how many state capitals.
I don't think so either.
That's probably true. Don't ask me what any capitals are right now. It's left my brain.
And
that's great.
We have a question from Jared. First, they wanted to thank you for the excellent conversation, but they also ask, is there an advisory role for students at Western Washington University or at Western Washington at the center?
There is. I don't know exactly how it works. There's a, the number of students who are actually majoring or minoring in the program is relatively small compared to most departments. That's because, again, it's not a discipline in the traditional sense. The first question a student gets if they go home and tell their parents, I'm majoring in Canadian studies, is what are you going to do with it? And it's a legitimate question. And so what we've always done is encouraged students to double major. So we think, for example, if you majored in economics and then majored in Canadian American studies, that would be great preparation, value added for somebody who wants to do economics work or business work on some aspect of Canada-U.S. trade, for example. So I forgot what the question was, though.
So it's about advisors or advisory.
So there's not that many students that are actually majors and minors, and I think the way probably should ask the current director what she does now, but what we did when I was director is we had a advisory group of faculty, and we always had a couple of students on the advisory group. And the other thing that we did is we made a point to have at least 2 lunches, seminar type events every year in which we would invite all the students to come, and we would spend quite a bit of time. We'd have a lunch, and then we'd have try to make an hour available after that to just talk about what needs to be done, what's not working, what should be working better, this kind of thing. That's what we did.
I think I remember that. I think that's when we first started talking about writing the book. Is that right? We were at one of the luncheons, the Scholars Week, with other students who presented their work in their Canadian studies. And then you came as an emeritus professor and retired. And I was there as the journal person. And we just had a nice lunch and then talked to scholars about their plans and their interests. And they presented their work. It's a great thing. And I'm sure it's still continuing because that's the outreach to students and to connect them with the program and Canadian studies is well done. I think it's a very nurturing house.
And with regards to the last question, I think the what they're trying to ask is can faculty give legal advice if a Western student has legal trouble while across the border?
Well, I guess it's up to the faculty member. That's an interesting question because that very problem or set of problems related to the border, whether it's immigration problems, whether it's drug problems, whatever it is, would come up frequently. I used to get phone calls from students, and my answer always was, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm also not a member of the Canadian government's immigration department, so I really can't advise you on this. What I can do, though, is I can tell you who to talk to. And that's the way I approach that.
That's fair. That's fair.
And yeah, I just saw that Christina the director of the center actually is here with us, and she just
Oh, good. Hi,
mentioned
Christina.
that, yeah.
Hi.
But
Uh-huh.
it's virtual, of course, right now. But yeah, there is advising. And,
Good. Oh, okay. So then make sure they acclimate. That's like I said, it's very nurturing. It's, you know, they're there for you. They don't leave you hanging as students. So. Mhm.
It's
and
a,
oh,
I'm
go ahead.
just going to add something since it's very important we talk more about students. But what I'd like to add is
Right.
that Canadian Studies is a program which, of course, is like all academic programs, is, you know, it's got its share of what we might used to call bookwork, which is to say the traditional kinds of academic work where you read stuff and you take tests and do all that kind of thing. I mean, it has all of that like any other program, but it also has a lot of hands-on opportunities, particularly with the Border Policy Research Institute. We've always had many students get involved in these research projects by faculty where the students are actually doing all kinds of interesting and useful research activities, which, and we try to do that throughout the program. I think they do it with the Salish Sea Institute. In fact, I'm sure they do. And I know they do it in the Canadian American Studies academic program. There's lots of places where there's internship opportunities. And this is actually mentioned in the book, our efforts over the years, which have not always been easy, to try to find ways and means to get students actually hands-on involved with Canadian studies. And that often means going to Vancouver, going to Ottawa, going to someplace else in Canada, or it might mean
Montreal.
going to the US State Department in Washington, D.C., or working for an environmental group in California that has, like the Sierra Club, that has an office in Canada. So this is something that Canadian Studies has always tried to do, is to make sure the students are involved in a direct hands-on kind of way, as well as reading their books, taking their tests, listening to lectures. Very important. I'm glad the question was raised.
And there's a couple more questions. Do you guys feel okay doing
Sure.
the last two?
Sure.
Okay.
Last two, sure.
How close are we? This is a question from Leslie. How close are we to having more content about Canada in our high schools in Whatcom County?
I
Oh,
hope we're close.
I, to be honest, I can't answer the question specifically about Whatcom County. My guess is there's probably been a bit more content over the years from the time I first started at Western way back in the 1970s, but it's a struggle. And one of the things that we do in the book is we document I think very carefully some of the battles that we had, and I call them battles because it's always, there's always a struggle
Always up and down.
trying to persuade
Mhm.
people to do what they
Right.
should be doing without being persuaded. And that means
Right.
teachers, administrators, even textbook publishers. There's a great story in there. If we have a minute, let me just tell you this quick story about public textbook publishers and their role in advancing Canadian studies in the elementary and junior high and high school levels. We found when we started the Study Canada project that one of the reasons teachers weren't teaching Canada in the 6th grade is because typically the textbook was Latin America and Canada, often called the hemisphere, and they always put Latin America first and Canada second. And what happened is the teachers ran out of time. They told us this in interviews. They ran out of time before they got to Canada, so they never got it taught. So what we did is we went to textbook publishers in California and Texas, where the most prominent textbook publishers are based, and they're the ones that have all the influence, it seems, and Florida is also in that category. And we said, look, why don't you just rearrange your book? Put Canada first, try it out. Put Latin America second, just try it. And some of them did. And of course, what happened, as you can guess, more people started teaching Canada because it was more accessible. So it's little things like that that you have to do. It's a constant kind of battle. I call it a battle. That's probably too harsh a word, but it's a constant struggle to try to get administrators and textbook publishers, school principals, you name it, teachers.
Right. It's because the
It's a
perception is sameness. Yeah.
It's a process of constant persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to do any of these things, especially in Washington State. We have very, very open, kind of easygoing process whereby you pick what you're going to teach in, for example, the 6th grade when it comes to social studies. And Canada's recommended, but it's not required. So you have to persuade people. You have to give them some reason why they should teach Canada. And often that means bringing them to an institute, spending a week with us where we go over all kinds of stuff and make it fun for them. And they go back to get excited. They go back to their schools. They get a core of other teachers that they work with. And the next thing you know, you've got a little nodule or a group of people someplace in Texas or Colorado or somewhere teaching Canada. And you say, well, how'd that happen? Well, just because you were able to persuade them to do it. It wasn't because somebody upstairs in the state house, the governor's office told them to do it. It's because we sort of worked on it, or
right at the teacher level, get the teachers excited and get them out there in the classroom and teach it. I would love to see more outreach for, when I've grown up in California, we learned the mission trail. And now, and everybody knows where all the missions are and all that stuff that we learned. We should learn that about Canada right here. It's shorter than the mission trail. Oh, yeah. And they should reach out to the center. Actually, the center is where you're going to find that information. And maybe even parents can just say, hey, I want my kids to learn a little bit more of where I came from, because a lot of parents are from the BC area and everything. So yeah.
And those interested in learning more about Canada in K through 12, or teachers too, teachers and parents that want curriculum in Wacom, they can contact Study Canada 12, and that's from
K-12.
Christina and Kyla in the chat.
Yeah, just contact the center. They'll tell you who and where. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Right. So,
And the last
other
question,
questions? Oh,
yeah, there's one more if that's okay with you guys.
Sure.
Is the journal Cat is the journal that you worked at on the ACSUS journal?
Oh, Axis. Yes, that's the that is the Association for Canadian Studies in the U.S. So ACSUS, Axis, that is a consortium of centers and Canadianists and both borders. They get together, and I worked for the journal for 9 years. That's how I met Dawn and Christina and everybody. I have a journal because I have thousands of them. Anyone? But yes, it is a publication of Axis, but it was housed at Western in Canada House for a time when we finally all got to be under one roof. BPRI, the CHC Institute, the ARCS journal, and then the curriculum and K-12. So we were all in the same house, and I worked there remotely with all these authors and researchers, and I read so many papers about Canadian issues, literature, Canadian war and peace, Canadian economy. It was so interesting to read all these research papers from around the world. I mean, we had submissions from Israel and India, and just talking about Canada and Canada's impact on the world and how Americans look at Canada. It was really fascinating. But yes, it is, to answer the question, it is a publication of Axis, and now it is hosted at Bridgewater State University in Orono, Maine. Is that correct? I forget where Bridgewater is.
It's actually in Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, sorry, I knew I got the M wrong. It's in Massachusetts at Bridgewater State, and it is being edited by Andy Holman, and Christina was the editor before she became director. So people take turns doing roles to get familiar with all kinds of anything Canada all day.
Let me just reinforce what was said a minute ago. I'm just looking at some of the questions. That if anybody has any questions about resources having to do with Canada, just contact the center. Contact Christina Kepi, the Center for Canadian American Studies at Western Washington University. They have a great website, and you can get whatever you need. They'd be happy to help you. And boy, it's a place where you can't believe the information that you can get from the center at Western. So
yeah, it's been a pleasure to be part of it, and I appreciate being pulled on board as well, because my limited Canadian knowledge did not stop me from being accepted by this group. So
Quick
I
study.
learned a lot.
Quick study.
Anyway, it's been a pleasure. It's been so great to work on this with you. We took some time. We did a lot of, back and forth and meeting at Village Books. We would sit at the writer's table up there and go over our strategies, some writing, things like that. It was really great. So it was great. So
I'd like to thank Village Books and certainly like to thank Deshali for
Thank
hosting us, and Claire, who wasn't able to be with us tonight, and I hope she's feeling better. And also Rachel Johnson, who
Rachel.
runs the publishing program at Village Books, which was so important in facilitating this whole effort for me. So thank you very much.
yes, that was great. And they're really great resources at Village Books too. So yeah.
And
I would
thank you guys.
also like to, can I just personally, I would like to
Absolutely.
actually just remember Chuck Hart for a minute, because he helped me so much, and he passed away last year too. And he was part of Canadian Studies. He was an interesting character. He knew everybody and everything and could connect anybody with anyone at Western. And I just wanted to just, on the record, let people just know he was a real important part of my entry into Canadian Studies in the house too. He was great. So he and Bob, bless their hearts. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Kat, and thank you, Don, so much for joining us today. That was a lovely discussion. It got me thinking about so many things.
Right.
And yeah, Vancouver is closer to Bellingham than Seattle is, and yet it feels so much further away. And thank you to our audience as well for
Yes,
joining us today and listening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for showing up, my friends.
I'm going to put into the chat the link to the Village Books YouTube, because all of our events are uploaded there. So if you wanted to see this one again, or if you wanted, or if your friends want to see it, or if you wanted to see one of our past events, you can just go to the Village Books YouTube channel. And also in the chat will be the link to the Village Books website, where you can buy Bridging the Longest Border online. We're also open every day until 8 p.m. If you live in Bellingham. And great, Christina sent the link to the website for the Center of Canadian American Studies. So thank you so much for that, Christina, as well.
Really engaged person. I love it.
Is there any final words that you guys have?
I think we could talk all night, but I think we were not.
I agree.
We did have some marathon Zoom sessions
Gotta leave something for the book.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's not give it all away.
All right. Well, I wish you all good night, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Nishali.